Okay, well, I'm really glad that all of you could come, and I hope you enjoyed the meal. I'd say we've got some dessert, which will be available after the lecture, and coffee and tea. And I'm very pleased with our speaker this evening. It's Professor Ralph Shain from Missouri State University. And he's in the philosophy department, as I understand it. And his topic tonight is there progress in philosophy? So proceed, Professor Shain.
Thank you. At a certain point in the 20th century, which happened to coincide with my time in school, metaphilosophy was much discussed. And it seemed like a major transformation was imminent for philosophy. The period was bracketed by two anthologies. One was called The Linguistic Turn, published in 1967, edited by Richard Rorty. Another was called After Philosophy, End or Transformation, edited by Tom McCarthy and Ken Baines and Jim Bowman. And that was published in 1986. So that really bracketed a certain period of expectation in philosophy. Since then, metaphilosophy has receded to the point of non-existence in academic philosophy. And I might add, the expected transformation never occurred. So I'm especially grateful to Tom Johnson and Dave Richards for the chance to present some metaphilosophical ideas on this question, is there progress in philosophy? I will present a view that the answer to the question is yes. And I will explain why it is so hard to see that this is so, that there is progress in philosophy. However, the interest in the question really arises perhaps less from the particular answer chosen as the chance to sketch a general view of what philosophy is and in what direction one hopes that it will go. In order to lay out the general view, I will sketch three interrelated orientations of philosophy and relate them to the question. These three orientations are philosophy as science, philosophy as critique, and philosophy as social theory. Now these are orientations. They are not separate categories. They interrelate in various ways, but those are the three parts of my talk. Philosophy as science, philosophy as critique, and philosophy as social theory. So first, philosophy as science. As a preliminary characterization of philosophy, I would offer that philosophy is the search for understanding. The love of wisdom sounds so old-fashioned and archaic, so I prefer the search for understanding. One may note that this characterization of philosophy in no way distinguishes it from scientific investigation. This is correct, and is in fact an important clue to understanding philosophy. In this part of the paper, I will be presenting a version of what has been called the midwife view of philosophy. The name is not the best, since the relationship of philosophy to the sciences is much more intimate than suggested by the metaphor of a midwife. Most of the sciences, physics, chemistry, geology, biology in part, economics, linguistics, sociology, and psychology derive from philosophy. In the intellectual world of classical Greece, there were intellectual subjects in addition to philosophy, such as history, mathematics, empirical medicine, and theology, but all of the sciences listed were part and parcel of philosophy. Over the long course of history, they eventually became separate branches within philosophy, then separate sciences. The split takes place, or at least should take place, when there is a sufficient understanding of the subject matter to achieve a consensus of the sort which remaining philosophical problems don't have. Now, not every separate discipline has achieved such a level of understanding. For example, political science. Now, from this little thumbnail sketch, I draw two conclusions. The first, from this perspective, one can see that philosophy is an empirical as much as a conceptual undertaking. And second, while this relation of philosophy and science makes the problem of characterizing philosophy more difficult, it does allow a further qualification of my initial characterization. Philosophy is the search for understanding with regard to those questions which have not achieved a separate scientific or separate disciplinary status. So philosophy deals with remnants, remainders, whatever's left over from the sciences which have split off. Now, I see no reason to think that there's anything in common among all these remainders, although I do think it is an open question. People often want to believe that this is so, since it would provide a nice division of philosophy from science, seeing each of these as distinct categories. On the one hand, so far as I know, no one has found a common factor in situation semantics, the aesthetic value of forgeries, care ethics, and the problem of induction. Right? These are all clearly philosophical problems that philosophers are now at work on. On the other hand, attempts to mark a clear distinction between science and philosophy don't hold up under scrutiny. For example, it has been claimed that science involves experiment and philosophy doesn't. But the classicist Gregory Vlastos has shown that the Greeks did understand and undertake experiments. It's just that the tools they had in order to perform them were extremely limited. Now let us consider a straightforward example of a specific question. The question of whether matter is made up of atoms was, of course, originally a philosophical question. The atomists, most famously Democritus, proposed this view, and Plato and Aristotle both weighed in on the question. By the time something approaching an answer was achieved 2,500 years later, this was a question in physics, which had in the intervening centuries become a separate discipline, actually several separate disciplines. The question was the same. What made it non-philosophical was precisely the success of philosophy in achieving greater understanding. Progress in philosophy is difficult to see, because if the progress is great enough, it gets chalked up as success in some other discipline, not philosophy. Given the continuity between philosophy and science, so that's my thesis here, the continuity between philosophy and science, the progress should be considered both philosophical and scientific. Now, the objection might be made that the philosophical question of atoms wasn't and hasn't been answered. If one wishes to say that the question was not whether matter was made up of atoms, which one might take to be the scientific question, but whether it was made up of atoms at the lowest level, or something like that. But such claims, because they try to clarify the question in a way which was not done by the Greeks, establish the point that I am trying to make. If we understand better how to state the question, then that shows that progress has been made. In this case, though, I don't think that the restatement offered does clarify the question, since the phrase, at the lowest level, is not well enough defined. So I am sticking with my claim. Exploring the microstructure of matter was at one time a philosophical undertaking, and now we have a much better understanding, owing to philosophy and science, of the microstructure of matter. This added understanding is progress in philosophy. Progress which has obscured its own philosophical nature. Other straightforward examples of the way in which science arose out of and blurs with philosophy can be found in empirical psychology. Psychology as a discipline does not derive exclusively from philosophy. It also has roots in attempts to cope with the mentally ill. But here are three examples of scientific claims or results which derive from the philosophical side of the ledger. Okay, all of these are just taken from the first page of a recent science section from the New York Times. First, there have been reports of a number of experimental findings showing that much of what is offered by people as a reason for a decision is actually a mere rationalization. while this claim was made by Nietzsche more than a century before. Second, a theory put forward by empirical psychologists, which has recently received a great deal of attention, argues that reason evolved to win arguments. Again, this is very similar to a claim put forward by Nietzsche. But Nietzsche didn't get mentioned in either of the science articles in the New York Times when it discussed these, as it put it, revolutionary theories. But the roots of empirical psychology in philosophy were stated clearly in a recent article which reported research by psychologists on what is called Molyneux's problem. The title of the article was "Study of Vision Tackles a Philosophical Riddle." Okay. Now, this problem is the question of whether someone blind from birth, suddenly able to see, would be able to recognize objects known previously by touch. Neither the author nor the titler of the article seem to grasp the fluidity of philosophical and scientific problems. And it is written as if scientists had solved a philosophical problem as if the categories were mutually exclusive. Now, this problem was put forth originally as a way of arguing or investigating empiricism in philosophy several centuries ago. Now, as with the case of atomic theory, progress in philosophy is obscured by its very occurrence, since credit for the progress accrues to the new discipline. Now, claiming that philosophy is continuous with science can be all too easily misunderstood because it stands or falls with an appropriate understanding of science. It is all too easy to attach the word science to only one science, physics. Problems which arise from this tendency include mistaken conceptions of the relations of different disciplines to each other. For example, claims of reductionism as being already established among the various sciences, and a mistaken conception of physics itself as being mathematical rather than empirical. So my claim of the continuity between physics and science also depends on a certain conception of science, that is, science is an empirical endeavor, and mathematics is useful in furthering that endeavor. Right. That's part one, philosophy as science. Part two, philosophy as critique. By critique, I mean pointing out failures in thinking or reasoning. I do not mean what Kant meant by the word. One of the tasks which philosophy undertakes is to find the flaws in various lines of reasoning. Philosophers can take as their targets philosophical or non-philosophical thinking. The sciences, which I've argued don't fall clearly into either category, philosophical or non-philosophical, are not immune from philosophical critique. Often the target is an extrapolation, when a leap is made from empirical or scientific thought to something which can just as well be described as philosophical. Critique, although arising from within philosophy, can be accomplished by anyone in any field. Often those outside of philosophy can do a better job of critique than philosophers, if philosophers think that critique can be accomplished a priori without knowledge of a particular field. So in the first part of my paper, I try to show philosophy is an empirical endeavor as much as conceptual, and philosophers who lose sight of that also have problems, I think, often in terms of their critique. Philosophy, having no special method, no longer has a corner on the critical market. But it does have a large stock of examples to draw on from its long history of critique. As long as philosophers avoid the idea that our critique can be a priori, we still have much to offer. The critiques that cause the most interest outside of academia are directed at religion. Religious belief is a segment of the much broader category of metaphysical belief, and I'm using metaphysics here in a specifically pejorative term, where it also has a legitimate term, just talking about the broadest questions of reality. Now, taking metaphysics in a pejorative sense raises a very thorny topic, with a multitude of such definitions out there. Now, I take metaphysics in the pejorative sense to be the project of overriding philosophy's search for understanding in order to attain reassurance. For my purposes, we can rely on Isaiah Berlin's definition of metaphysics as the convergence of the goods. So a metaphysical view in this sense tries to establish that there is no conflict, or there could be no conflict, among all of the good things in the world. Metaphysical thinking attempts to establish that, well, as Kierkegaard put it, nothing of value is lost, or as Hegel put it, that the real is the rational, or that there is a type of life which makes one invulnerable to contingency. That would be Socrates, Plato, and too many other philosophers to mention. Now, the masters of critique of metaphysical views are, in my opinion, David Hume, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Ludwig Wittgenstein. Hume's essay on miracles is a clear example. John Stuart Mill's essay, Nature, is another, and Wittgenstein provided an array of critical tools for dissolving problems. Wittgenstein said we should look to see where philosophers have a paucity of examples, are trapped by a picture, are misled by grammar, where philosophers fail to consider context or background, impute presuppositions, or treat terms as essentialist rather than as involving family resemblances. Progress, then, I would say, comes with new and more powerful critical tools, perhaps also through improvements in theories brought about by these critiques. Now, metaphysical views typically appeal to an atemporal realm, something outside of time, whether it be God, the forms, or tenseless predication, but they need not. Heidegger's account of authenticity and resoluteness in being and time aims for invulnerability without an appeal to atemporality. It is not always obvious what metaphysical commitments a theory has. They can require a lot of interpretive labor. So one might spend a whole philosophical career interpreting just one or two philosophers just to see how they fit in with these ideas. But even that kind of interpretation, I would say, fits in with how I'm characterizing philosophy here. Because of philosophy's history of privileging formal logic and tenseless predication, the concept of critique needs to be rethought. Analytic philosophy, and I should say this points to something that was expected when I said at the beginning, that it was expected that there would be radical changes in philosophy that haven't really taken place. Analytic philosophy, by taking formal logic as central and formative, even as ontologically determinative, appeals to the atemporal every bit as much as Plato or Hegel. One need only consider the way history forces its way back into ahistorical theories. A highly instructive analysis is Richard Wollheim's book, Art and Its Objects. After a careful review and refutation of the leading definitions of art proposed by analytic philosophers, he concludes that art cannot be defined because it is historical. Another noteworthy case is provided by John Rawls' theory of justice, determinedly ahistorical. In his later book, Political Liberalism, however, Rawls is led by his critics to admit that, quote, the appropriate limits of public reason vary depending on historical and social conditions. Once rethought, critique will fall in line with informal logic more than formal logic, and philosophy will be reconstituted as a field in which history, especially the history of thought, will be central and formative. Nietzsche, Benjamin, Kuhn, Lakatos, and Foucault can be seen as transition figures in this process. I might say, here's one of the connections between the first part of the paper and the second part, that is, trying to view philosophy historically is important to getting an adequate conception of philosophy. So that's what I did in the first part of the paper. Now, not all efforts at critique have been or should be as grandiose as taking on metaphysics. Simply pointing out false dichotomies in reasoning can be very important. One example would be Gadamer's critique of Leo Strauss. Another would be Habermas's critique of Adorno. Other such non-grandiose, albeit more complex critiques, would be Judith Jarvis Thompson's essay on abortion, as well as Wittgenstein's dissolution of specific philosophical problems. Now, it may be responded that this endeavor is not unique to philosophers. This is true, but hardly counts as an objection against taking critique as part of the disciplinary identity of philosophy. As long as fallacious arguments are proposed by those in other disciplines, or in philosophy, and as long as philosophers have something to contribute, the effort will be worthwhile. A more serious concern, given the question of progress, concerns the outcome of such critiques. If the mistaken views are replaced by other equally mistaken views, then it would be difficult to establish that critique actually leads to progress. Now, the progress shown in the first part of this paper, shows that at least sometimes critiques have led to progress, and it's pretty clear that philosophy has contributed to progress in overcoming metaphysical views. Now, whether critique has led to progress with regard to other questions, still within the domain of philosophy, is a much more difficult issue. Of course, most philosophical critical efforts are directed at other philosophers. The metaphysical impulse, whether religious or aiming for some technique for living, has pervaded philosophy since its origin. It may seem as if we have a situation contrary to the position of philosophy in Part 1, where philosophy failed to receive credit for its progress. Here, in talking about critique, maybe philosophy receives credit it doesn't deserve, like an arsonist who wants credit for extinguishing fires he himself sets. So philosophy creates these problems, then it brings in the critiques. Maybe that's not progress. Okay? Now, whether this is so depends on whether the metaphysical claims made by philosophers would have been offered without the institution of philosophy. If those views would have arisen in any event, then one can give credit to the critics for pointing out the flaws as a lesson for those who later would have thought them up. Part 3. Philosophy as social theory. Now, in this section, I wish to say something about what I take to be an important direction that philosophy should be moving in. Given the conception sketched in the previous two sections, I clearly don't think that this is the only valuable work that philosophers can do. Philosophy is multiple and various. However, I think it is of singular importance that philosophy endeavored to develop a general social theory which is empirically based and normatively oriented. This project can be thought of as continuing the project of the first generation of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Now, for those of you who haven't studied these thinkers, they were German philosophers who started this project in the 1930s, continuing through the 1960s, and their approach to society can be summed up through an attempt to synthesize the theories of Freud and Marx with a special emphasis on art. They thought art was extremely important. Now, advocacy for such a project is especially important because of the need for a reorientation in the way political and moral philosophers relate their work to other disciplines and empirical matters generally. Now, political philosophy has been dominated by, I'm back to John Rawls in his book Theory of Justice. Even though Rawls assumes that the social sciences have achieved far more than they actually have. Regarding those in what Rawls calls the original position, he says, it is taken for granted, however, that they know the general facts about human society, they understand political affairs and the principles of economic theory, they know the basis of social organization and the laws of human psychology. Indeed, the parties are presumed to know whatever general facts affect the principles of justice. Now that much philosophical argument concerns disputed facts. In other words, it's disputed what are the general facts about human society? What are the principles of economic theory? What is the basis of social organization? Right? That philosophical argument concerns these disputed facts, and that much of the social scientific knowledge relevant to political philosophy is unknown. Neither of these points is considered by Rawls. Against Rawls, I would say those engaged in normative philosophy ought to see the boundaries between their work and social science as porous, rather than thinking of themselves as hovering above the empirical world, then swooping down to pass judgments upon it. So philosophers should not think of themselves as doing mere conceptual work, but as pointed out in the first part of the paper, should see their work as continuous with science, including social science. If we think of the project of critical theory as an attempt to integrate sociology and psychology, so we might see the key issue is how does the individual relate to society, which is a problem because the individual is studied in psychology and society is studied in sociology. Now, while bringing to bear economics and history, then we can see at a very general level what new direction the project needs to take. Marxian sociology can no longer be considered the state of the art, as the Frankfurt School thought, and the prodigious theory of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu provides the obvious substitute. In the field of psychology, the situation is not so clear. Much of Freud has been overthrown or superseded, and other approaches to psychology have provided valuable insights and need to be considered. However, I think some variant of psychoanalytic theory will still provide the key starting points because it takes desire to be central in a way that alternatives have not. Of course, history and economics, with updated research programs, will play a major role, plus the advances made by feminist theory will need to be integrated. Issues of hierarchy will be front and center, but some of the other concepts which will be of importance will be technology, art, recognition, gender, and progress. Now these are topics that, of course, philosophers have either worked on in the last 30 or 40 years, or I think should have done much more work on in the last 30 or 40 years. Now I mentioned the last term, progress, as one of the terms in this project, because the title of this paper has to do with progress. So the question is, there progress in philosophy is part of this project. Now, need I add that terms like justice and happiness are also in need of critical thought. As Max Horkheimer, one of the founders of the Frankfurt School, noted, the project of critical theory can expect to change as its understanding of its basic concepts is transformed. Overall, though, the point that needs to be emphasized is that as much attention needs to be paid to what is unknown as to what is known in the human and social sciences. Now, this proposal clearly is one possible continuation of the two orientations of philosophy described in the first two parts of the paper. It sees the agenda of philosophy as striving to increase our understanding of the world in a way which is continuous with, rather than distinct from, other disciplines. It sees philosophy as focusing its critical tools on questions left hanging by other theorists, perhaps because they fall between the cracks, or perhaps because they are botched by other disciplines owing to institutional imperatives or to ideology. However, it is with regard to this third orientation toward philosophy that the positions taken in the first two orientations are, in a way, reopened for consideration. The search for understanding, whether under the heading of science or critique, might itself be subject to critique on normative grounds. The possible conflict between knowledge and morality is clearly shown in the need for moral restrictions on human and animal experimentation. When striving for a happier, better, or more just society, And the precise relations among these terms, happy or just, and the extent to which each should be taken as a goal of critical theory remains to be determined. We have to consider the possibility that ignorance, error, even delusion may play a much more extensive role than the above-mentioned example of restrictions on experimentation. If this is so, perhaps the search for understanding is misguided or should be derailed rather than merely limited or redirected in order to accomplish these other goals. Now, I hope not. I hope we can continue with the search for understanding. But the possibility cannot be ruled out. In conclusion, I have argued that there has been progress in philosophy, although in order to make that argument, I have claimed that we have to give up our ideas of philosophy as a unified area of inquiry, one with a set of problems and techniques which is unique and proper to itself. I have argued, or I have discussed, 4 orientations in philosophy. Philosophy is science, philosophy is critique, philosophy is social theory, but also philosophy as consolation. And even this list is not exhaustive. There are at least 2 other orientations, philosophy as self-expression and philosophy as mental playground. But I will not discuss them here. The key point is that of the heterogeneity of philosophy, both within each orientation, but especially across the various orientations. Because of the various ways that the orientations overlap and conflict, philosophy should be seen as multiple. Groping through the ruins and remnants left behind by its own progress in producing the sciences and other disciplines, focusing on loose ends in the interstices of other disciplines, trying to solve or dissolve the problems remaining to it, fighting rearguard actions against metaphysics, and trying to think its way toward a better and more just society. Here is philosophy as I have experienced it and as I have tried to present it in this paper. I believe that the metaphilosophical misconceptions, philosophical misconceptions have held up and continue to block the chances for further progress in philosophy. I hope that the first step forward is to view the field historically as I have tried to do.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
We have dessert and coffee available, and I believe Professor Shain will be around for a little bit if anyone has questions.